PBS and Tribune and his own startup. He knows this business pretty well. What I think is fun about Tom is he's got a great energy level and really, really funny and sarcastic, which I totally appreciate, and I would suspect many of us on the call will. So I want to turn it over to Tom at this point, so he has a full opportunity to take us on this journey. And I know he has some time built in for questions, and I hope you take advantage of that. We're probably going to have to mute people, so you'll have to sort of unmute yourself to come on. And as always, the chat is available as well.
Thanks for the kind intro, Fran. All sarcasm aside, and believe me, there will be more than a little bit of sarcasm in the deck. You can't spend 40 years in and around newsrooms without being infected by that. All snarkiness aside, I am thrilled to be here today. INN, I've been a fan of the organization, but particularly its members for a long time now, whether it's my old competitor, Dan Christensen at Florida Bulldog, or my old colleague, Robert McClure at Investigate West, and all 100 plus in between. You guys are doing vital work inventing the future of journalism. I'm thrilled to be able to contribute in even a tiny way to hoping to make all of you a little more powerful and a little better at what you do and a little more sustainable. What we're going to talk about today is what is, in classic marketing terms, an audience development plan, or in other words, understanding who you are trying to serve, how you can reach them, and more important for sustainability, how you can convince a subset of them, maybe as few as 5%, to give you money to carry out your mission. The best way to start to discuss that topic, though, is with some real-life examples. And I want to start with two newsrooms in particular. Both of them tried to start as an independent journalism organization because of hard times at the local daily newspaper. The first of those new newsrooms set out very specifically to recreate a closed local newspaper. They set out to hire 30 people, and some of you who are already doing math in your head, yeah, that means a lot of money. They set out with a model of trying to get subscribers to pay, and they figured out if they could get 50,000 paying subscribers at $60 a year, they could make this work. But they also gave themselves a deadline. We're going to get those 50,000 subscribers in just 6 weeks. The second newsroom wasn't the closing of the local newspaper, but it was a substantial round of layoffs at the local newspaper, including the firing of a venerated local columnist that led some other people to say, we need to create a competitive force to the local newspaper in our community as well. We're going to do it with just 4 people, and we're still going to try and do almost everything that newspaper will do. We're going to do that by adding the Associated Press and all of those legacy costs to our news organization as well. Their business model was simple. We got a rich guy who's going to pay for all of it. Now, I know you're waiting for the payoff. One of these succeeded, and one of these did not. And what are the lessons to learn out of that? But the first truth is, both of these organizations very nearly failed, and spectacularly so. The first organization I was talking about there was an outfit called In Denver Times. They got started right after the closure of the Rocky Mountain News back in late 2008, early 2009, and it was very much intended as a pure replacement for the Rocky. All of those 30 people I mentioned had worked at the Rocky. Rather than going out and trying to get new jobs when the Rocky closed, they said, we're going to start our own organization. And while that's wonderful, this 6-week deadline they gave themselves was timed entirely to coincide with the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Rocky Mountain News. Because, you know, consumers everywhere are clamoring for that sesquicentennial celebration of the founding of the Rocky Mountain News. And they're going to give money, you know, entirely because of that completely artificial deadline that they put themselves with. In only 6 weeks, they were able to attract only 3,000 subscribers. And the entrepreneurs and angel investors that they were counting on to provide some of the seed capital to supplement that $3 million they were trying to raise, they pulled out. The people who tried launching in Denver Times struggled on for a little bit longer, but within the end of 12-month period, that project was dead as a doornail. Let's talk about that second newsroom. Some of you may know it well, Voice of San Diego. And before all of you think, well, what did they do right? I think it's important to recognize what they did wrong. They really floundered in their first year. Neither of their first two editors-in-chief lasted till their 6-month anniversary. Both resigned under pressure. They struggled to find the right mix of content that they were offering. Yes, they had excellent investigations into the incredible corruption that was infesting San Diego city government at that time. But they were also trying to crank a lot of staff dailies, including a lot of fairly routine coverage. They had a massive strategy around user-generated content that they hoped would yield high-quality pieces, but instead yield the usual sort of self-serving fluff that most UGC projects come from. And they also faced an incredible sword of Damocles because they were organized as a nonprofit, but were still getting most of their funding from a single very wealthy donor, Buzz Woolley. They faced a 36-month clock from the IRS to diversify their funding ranks. At the end of that first year, they were facing real problems. The success all came down to two people, two reporters, and a plan. It's Andrew Donahue at the top. He was at the time a reporter at Voice of San Diego. Scott Lewis at the bottom, also a reporter at Voice of San Diego. After watching their second editor in less than a year leave the organization, after seeing close up and personal that the organization was floundering a little bit, the two of them in classic reporter fashion got together and they said, somebody's got to do something about this and it might as well be us. They went back to their board of directors with a plan. We're going to rigorously focus our content. We are going to stand on 3 legs, and those 3 legs are news, especially investigative news about public affairs in San Diego. We're going to focus on opinion. We're going to focus on interactivity. We're going to use this new medium in ways that it can excel. We're going to do things that the Union Tribune can't do. They had a relentless focus on the right content. They had a relentless focus on audience development and serving the civically engaged reader in San Diego. Over time, that led to grants and donations that made Voice of San Diego what it is today. This is not to say they didn't have some stumbles along the way. They had some layoffs. They had years where their donations didn't match what they thought they would. They struggled, as every entrepreneur does. But when things were tough at the end of that very first year, Scott and Andrew pulled together a plan that saved that organization and made Voice of San Diego what it is today. Without realizing it, without putting that name to it, the plan that they built closely resembles what marketers would call an audience development funnel or a marketing development funnel. And that funnel way of thinking, that understanding of the audience, is that critical first step that led Voice of San Diego to success, and I would suggest is a critical element in any startup organization or any organization that's trying to move to the next level, achieving that success. At its simplest, an audience development funnel is a deep understanding by the organization of that universe of people who might be interested in your product, your service, your news organization, your app, your website. And farther down that funnel, that's much smaller group of people who love your product so much that they will help pay for it and that they will help promote it. Along the way in that funnel, you've got several fairly common, generally accepted steps. They start with awareness. I have heard of this thing that you are trying to do. Moves on to experience. I have tried your product. Moves on to habit. I prefer your product. I check in with it a couple times a week or every day. Loyalty. I cannot do without your product. It is my go-to source for news and information about. And finally, advocacy. Money? You want money? Sure. I'll give you money. And in fact, I'll give you money and I will promote you to my friends. When you think about it, think about public media, for example. Think about some of the subscription offers that some of the leading organizations like New York Times or Washington Post are offering. They're all following, usually in an unstated way, this sort of development funnel. WAMU here in the Washington, D.C. area just wrapped up one of their 5-day spring fundraising campaigns, and they were unabashed in talking about guilt. They were unabashed in saying, we know that many of you listen to us every day, but we also know that out of the million or so people who listen to us in a given week, only about 80,000 give money. Don't be one of those freeloaders, give us money. They are very thoughtfully taking people on a journey down that funnel. We know that you habitually listen to us. We'd like to move you down into that loyalty and advocacy stage by giving us money. This is a classic way of organizing how you think about your marketing efforts, how you think about tying those marketing efforts back to your long-term financial stability. It's important to know, though, and to think a little bit about why we do what we do, because that impacts how you pour audience or potential members into the top of that funnel and how you even think about what it is precisely you're doing. At the risk of going back to the deep, dark days of history before all my hair was gray, it's important to remember how what we do now has to differ from how we did in the allegedly good old days. In those allegedly good old days, news organizations were many things to many people. Think of this edition of the Washington Post, for example, which dates back to, I think, 2010 when I first used a version of this slide. And I stole this slide from an old boss and mentor of mine from the Chicago Tribune a long time ago. Newspapers were classic 6 o'clock local news broadcasts were actually a bundle of many different types of news and information. It was many things to many people. We were able to do that because it was so expensive to compete with us. Very few people had the $200 million, for instance, that it would take to set up a printing and distribution operation in a major metro news area to compete with the local incumbent newspaper. Even fewer people had God and the FCC on their side to give them a broadcast license so that they could take on the local purveyor of the 6 o'clock news. When you've got these near monopoly organizations, basic economics dictates that you try to serve the largest audience possible. You try to do most things to most people. We're going to have local and national and world headlines of the day, and we're going to have well-written feature stories and Dilbert and Doonesbury and the crossword puzzle too, and we'll have those West Coast stores, and we'll have all of this delivered to you in a single package. Now, the truth of the matter is, legacy news organizations were great at all of those things. But because there were so few organizations that could effectively compete with them, being good enough was in fact good enough. And there were enormous financial rewards to being most things to most people. The bundle, in other words, worked. Well, the good old days were good, but then a funny thing happened. The scarcity of distribution, that $200 million printing press problem or that broadcast license problem disappeared because of this medium that we're all talking about and talking over today. With digital distribution, suddenly you don't need a $200 million printing plant to compete with your local daily newspaper. You don't need a God and FCC granted broadcast license to be able to broadcast video. You can go to YouTube, you can go to WordPress, you can do all of these things, which meant that the Washington Post, for their national and international coverage, is facing competition from all sorts of other people who could not effectively distribute a product in Washington without the internet. In local news, they're facing all sorts of competition from local weeklies and even from neighborhood blogs. If any of you are in the DC area, think of Arlington Now or the Prince of Petworth. All of that style stuff is really competing now with national and international niche sites. The comics are being distributed directly. Sports, you're suddenly going head to head with ESPN, and on and on and on. All of those forces are serving to rip apart the bundle That's why those legacy news organizations are struggling so badly financially. Most things to most people in a highly competitive environment is a terrible place to be. Just ask Sears. The bundle's broken down with that loss of scarcity. So if that bundle doesn't work anymore, what does? If you're not most things to most people, what are you? As it happens, there's a ton of really good academic research around that question. Some of the best comes from this guy, Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. He's the author, among many other things, of the classic business book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which talks about the impact of technological change on incumbent providers. It might as well have been written for the legacy news industry. Because Clayton's a wonderful guy, he did some partnership work with the American Press Institute going back about 10 years ago, and he really honed in on this notion. Consumers don't flock to the product that you are putting out in front of them just because you have a product. They flock to you because you are doing something for them. You are performing a job for them. He puts it this way: nobody goes out to Home Depot to buy a drill to have one more power tool in their basement. He's actually wrong on that. I might, but most people aren't like me with collections of different tools clogging up the basement. People don't buy drills to have a drill. They buy a drill because every now and then they are going to need a 1/4 inch hole in the wall so that they can put in a wall anchor and either hang a picture or hang a coat rack or something else. It's not the drill that is important to them. It's the hole. It's the job that they need done. When you frame what it is that we do as journalists in that sense, it changes your mindset. It forces you to think in terms of the audience. Saying, for instance, that our site exists to fill the news void in our community. No consumer actually thinks that way. When the Rocky Mountain News closed and the In Denver Times phone, my God, there's a massive void of information in our community. We need to fill it. No consumer woke up saying, oh my God, there's a massive void of information in my community. Consumers are drowning in information. It may not be very good. It may not be well curated, but there's no shortage of content and information out there. That doesn't mean the consumers don't have jobs, though. The job that they might have around the news and information is, I can't find the good stuff among all the crap that's in my Facebook feed. Or it might be, there's no one actually keeping a close eye on city government in the way that I would like them to. And as a concerned citizen, you know, most of my neighbors don't care about that, but as a concerned citizen, that really, really worries me. Reframing the question, what's the job that we were doing, is the vital difference that can separate successful organizations from less than successful ones. Let's take a look at a couple examples of what that looks like. These are from the mission statements of 3 fairly successful nonprofit news organizations. And while mission statements are often very lofty and aspirational, you can look at each one of these 3 and you can pull out phrases, words that starts to indicate that they really understand what job it is that they're seeking to do for their communities. Voice of San Diego just flat out says, we are about groundbreaking investigative journalism for San Diego, and it's about increasing civic participation. ProPublica talks about exposing abuses of power and betrayals of the public trust. Chalkbeat, wonderful education site, both nationally and in, I believe it's now 5 or 6 selected markets, talks about their mission being to improve schools for all children. Note that by defining their jobs that they're seeking to do for consumers, that by defining them as tightly as they do, they are intentionally and very thoughtfully saying, we are not going to try to be all things to all people. I dare say that Voice of San Diego, defining their work as groundbreaking investigative work to increase civic participation, that effectively means we are not going to try to serve all 3 million plus people who live in the San Diego. We're going to seek to super serve that portion of those 3 million people who are civically engaged, who really, really care. By focusing that way, they're going to make sure that they fulfill that job that that civically engaged person wants, exposing public corruption, doing real enterprise reporting, and not worrying so much about the car crashes on the I-5 or even things like military plane crashes out of Miramar. Scott Lewis talks very passionately about, shortly after he took over as editor of Voice of San Diego, there was a crash at the Naval Air Station. And he and Andrew and their staff consciously decided, TV's at the scene, the Union Tribune's flooding the zone, we are not going to chase that story. Instead, we're going to get to work on the story of what happens when naval planes are taking off and landing over these very dense communities. And they were able to do an investigative piece in a hurry that found out that engineers, people planning the development in and around the Miramar Naval Air Station, had said years before, if we don't keep clear zones, if we don't keep land around this Naval Air Station that is clear of other development, we're going to have something like an air crash happen on a neighborhood someday. And sure enough, those engineers were right. By defining their mission as we're going to do investigative work around for the civically engaged, Voice of San Diego is able to decide we're not going to chase certain stories and we're going to focus on others. We're going to do work that has unique local value. It's obviously an implication in all that, though. If you define yourself as serving and super serving certain audiences, you are leaving out other audiences. And that quickly gets to the point of, are there enough people in that audience who care so that your work can have impact and so that you can attract enough financial donations to survive? That forces you into doing research, into really understanding the community that you're trying to cover, either a community of geography or a community of niche passion, a community of interest, let's call it. Doing that research, understanding the total potential size of your audience is absolutely vital to understanding if your organization can be financially viable with its current mission. To illustrate this, I am going to use an intentionally and admittedly absurd example. I think I mentioned in passing already, I grew up in Minnesota. We are winter sports freaks in Minnesota, and every 4 years at the Olympics, you know, about the only time that people actually care about curling, us native Minnesotans were in our element. I grew up in a hilly suburban neighborhood. We built our own little sledding tracks every winter. I almost broke my knee one year doing it. So things like luge and bobsled, I get really geeked out about it every 4 years. I found myself last month watching the Winter Olympics, watching the luge competition in particular, and thinking, there's a site to be built around sliding sports. They're cool, they're fast, they seem made for millennials. There might be something here. So I started playing around with the notion. What would a site look like if we're serving the needs of the winter sports community by writing about Olympic caliber athletes in sliding sports, but only those who happen to be from Utah? Because Utah is one of only 2 places in the country where we have a bobsled track. As I said, it's an admittedly absurd example, and I set out to be intentionally absurd because when you dig into the numbers, the number of winter sports sliding athletes who happen to be from Utah, it's 2. These 2 guys here on the U.S. luge sliding team. The point of all that is just that. If your audience is only 2 people, there's no there. You're too narrow of a niche. So obviously, a site about winter sliding sports, Olympic caliber athletes from Utah isn't going to work. But what's that calculation? What's that research look like for your niche? If you say the top of the audience funnel is about all of the people who might be interested in your topic, those 3 million people who happen to live in and around San Diego, for example, you need to quickly start filtering out. How many people live in that geographic area? If we're going to define ourselves as not serving all 3 million people who live in San Diego, but only those people who are civically engaged, how many of them are there? Well, maybe you measure that through a rough proxy. How many people bother to show up to vote? Or maybe you're doing a niche site around education. Well, I would quickly want to understand 2 different sets of numbers. 1, how many parents have school-aged children in this community? Because that's really one audience that I'm going to want to serve if I'm doing an education site. I also want to know a second site, a second potential audience. How many teachers, how many school administrators, how many school board members, how many other people are sort of involved in the education industry as an industry? These are all findable facts. It's hard work sometimes digging out some of them, but this is basic research that you need to know and understand if you're going to be successful in your geographic community. What's the similar exercise around communities of interest? Let's say you're writing a site about a passion. I've been working on a project recently for a client investigating craft spirits, craft whiskeys, craft beers, craft alcohol in general. Well, we know that there are 350 or give or take a million Americans. We know of those, there's slightly north of 200 million who are of legal drinking age. But how many of those people don't just drink Budweiser or Seagram's or whatever? They're drinking craft beer, craft spirits. As it happens, there are trade associations that track exactly that sort of data. They even keep track of how much share of people spending on alcohol goes to something like that. For that particular project, that level of data was incredibly helpful in figuring out whether there's something there. And in fact, there's something potentially massive there, as it turns out. The point of that being, if you're doing not a geographic site, but you're doing something that's more nationally focused or regionally focused on a community of interest, you've got to get beyond the demographics to understanding the number of people who are interested in that passion, interested in that topic. I teach versions of courses like this at the University of Maryland and American University. I had a student recently pitch as part of their project work, a site about quilting. Quilting is just, yeah, 20 million Americans engage in quilting every year. Wait, what? And she ran through her research and proved to me, no, there's something there around quilting. The point of this is, I know this all sounds like scary marketing research, but it's vital to perform. And as it turns out, it's not as scary or as foreign as you might think it is, especially to those of us who grew up as reporters. I want to assure you that as Scott Lewis and Andrew Donahue proved, journalists actually know how to do this stuff, whether we realize it or not. Market research, the gathering of that data, it's actually just reporting. That first bits of data and information you get about your potential audience, it's very analogous to when reporters would pitch me as an editor on the idea of doing a major investigative project. Give me 6 weeks off. I never gave anybody 6 weeks off at first. I said, you got 3 days, come back with that quick sniff. Prove to me that there's a there. A potential audience, those first numbers you find are that quick sniff of data. The audience development plan, the way that you're going to engage that potential audience, think of that almost as the first story in a long-running series that you're going to write as a reporter. In your organization's financial success, it's really nothing more than those repeated follow-ups, the kind of hammering reporting that my old friend Andy Martin used to do when he got a couple very corrupt port commissioners convicted in South Florida. The point is, as reporters, we may not think that we know about market research, but all of the processes that we know as reporters, finding stuff out, synthesizing it, developing it into a summary of facts, and then a series of actions we're going to recommend based on those facts. We know how to do this. This is the reporting process. Where to begin? A couple places. Of course, U.S. Census, any of us who've ever done any sort of computer-assisted reporting know that the demographic data that they have is the basis for all of the marketing research that goes on across the United States and indeed throughout all of North America. They are a terrific resource, especially if you're covering communities of interest. I already mentioned if you're covering communities of passion, topics that aren't necessarily geographic based, I bet you there are trade associations, industry groups, hobby groups that have some sort of data that gives you that starting point for your questions about how you're going to serve an audience and what the potential size is. Second source that's often overlooked, your good old neighborhood reference librarian. Be that person at a public library, a community, a city or county library, or be that somebody in the library services at a local university. Odds are, whether you know it or not, between your contacts at community foundations, your boards of director members, different philanthropists you know, the local J school. You probably know somebody who can get you access to a great reference librarian, or at least make some introductions to some people who may know that data. Reference librarians love talking about all the data that they have tucked away in their databases and on their shelves that you don't even know how helpful it could be. So census reference librarians are excellent starting points for that very first calculation you have to do, which is what's the total size of your potential audience. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Just want to summarize though quickly. Couple takeaways from this. One, ask yourself, what job are you trying to do for consumers? Is it actually a job they want done? Is it, I'm going to give them a hole in their wall so they can hang a picture, versus I'm going to give them a drill? I would challenge you all, don't be like in Denver Times. We're going to fill the information needs of our community. Your community's drowning in information. Go the next step. Figure out how you're going to help that audience filter that information or deliver information that they don't know that they need. So what job are you trying to do? Second, how big is that potential audience? And then lastly, how do you reach those people, get them in the top of that funnel, and what steps can you take to move them down that funnel to habitual readers and users, to loyal readers and users, and finally readers and users who will write you a check and give you money to sustain your organization. Obviously, there's a lot more there than we can ever hope to cover in an hour, which is why I'm pleased to be working with Fran and others at INN on a new program, a 3-month, 90-day course for a group of 8 members to really work through those questions and to develop your own audience development plan for your organization. We will go into great depth on all of these topics and more. And then more to the point, we will take great pains to take that audience development funnel that you're going to research and work through and tie it back to your fundraising and financial goals for your organization. Fran will have some information and some links later about the details for how you can find out more and potentially sign up for that class. But I'm going to shut up now, and I want to hear some of your thoughts, some of your questions. Let's turn this into a conversation rather than a monologue.
Hi, this is Lyle Muller from Iowa Watch. And one of the things that I noticed was you didn't do a lot of talk about going to moneyed people, and that of course was launched from your opening about the failure of that. But when you're looking at loyal audiences and people who are going to be loyal to you, what type of weight do you put into who has money and who does not have money?
So my time in public media at PBS, but doing a lot of station outreach work at PBS that included local stations that also owned NPR stations, taught me an enormous amount. There's actually research that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has done that shows some of the best and most loyal donors to local PBS and NPR news stations are people who rarely watch this or listen to the station. They want the service to be available, and they're willing to fund it whether they are loyal users or not. That is not to say that you don't want to make sure that you're raising money from your audience. That is to say, if you can prove that you're providing value to that audience and serving your community, there may be other people who aren't in your audience who will pony up. I don't think you want to fall into the trap of saying we need to super serve an audience that has a higher than average household income, because you'll end up missing great stories. You'll end up not carrying out your mission of serving the community. You do need to understand the composition. Who is in your audience? Who among those you might be able to ask for money? That's really more for the fundraising side of the house, but for those of us who find ourselves occasionally in roles like executive directors, you gotta make sure that you understand that. It all really does start though with just serving that audience and defining that job to be done. As you get moving down that funnel and really are identifying the differences between your loyal users and your casual users, you're going to stumble across some implications, ways that you can ask those loyal users to write you a check, ways that you can get some of those loyal users to introduce you to foundations or to philanthropists who happen to share the mission that you have, whether they read you or not. So there are lots of ways to tie that back to the fundraising efforts. And believe me, I am passionate about fundraising being an important part of your strategic plans. No money, no mission. It doesn't necessarily need to correlate one-to-one, though, with your audience development plan. Did that answer your question, Lyle? Excellent, thank you. Speak at the chat window too. Okay, yeah, lots of questions about that class, which is excellent. Who's policing the homework? Julie, that'll be me. And you can, Julie Drisman from Current, the publication that does a marvelous job covering public media. Current happens to be headquartered at AMU. Julie, I challenge you to find some of my old students from American. I can be a real hard ass on the homework. If you don't do the homework, you're not going to end up with an audience development plan. And at the end of that class, if you don't have an audience development plan, and more to the point, you're not really rigorously committed to carrying out that plan, then we're just kind of wasting each other's time. And that's not going to help anybody. So yeah, we're gonna be pretty hard ass on the homework. It's not that bad. It does though. The homework really consists of getting out and talking to a lot of paying customers, getting out, or potential paying customers, I should say, understanding what their needs are, understanding what job they have that you could do that happens to serve your mission and happens to give you a path towards raising money. Other questions, other comments?
This is Tom Laskaway with the Food and Environment Reporting Network. I'm a little curious about your thoughts. For some of us national organizations, we're subject specific. We cover obviously food and environment reporting. Talking about reaching audience, I mean, it's obviously a big challenge for us, and we've, I think, done a good job to this point thinking about ways and how we can usefully serve our audience. But as we want to grow, that's the big question. How do you reach new audience members when you're talking that, when you don't have that geographical basis?
Yeah, I think that's a vital question for national and regional organizations, especially those serving niches. I'll answer it by telling a story. One of the other people, probably one of the best in the business at teaching the audience development funnel and building an audience development plan, is Tim Griggs. Some of you may know Tim from his work at the New York Times, where he was part of the team that launched the New York Times metered paywall. Some of you may know him from his time at Texas Tribune, where he was Evan's publisher and chief operating officer for a time. Tim tells the story about how Texas Tribune, at one point in time, they had something on, and don't hold me to these numbers, they're directionally right, but I'm going off the top of my head, where they figured that they had something like 80,000 unique visitors at the time, and they figured, we're doing a pretty good job. 80,000 people is probably our total potential audience. And they started digging in and doing a little more research, and they realized, no, actually their potential audience was well into the hundreds of thousands and probably into the low single-digit millions, even by the time you filtered out the 25 million plus Texans and then put a screen on that for the number of those people who were really civically engaged and cared about public affairs in Texas. They realized that the audience they were reaching was just a fraction of the audience that they should be reaching, and a fraction of the audience that could be their potential donors. So they set out and developed a really rigorous plan built around testing different ideas. If we do events out in all four corners of the state, does that help increase our audience? Turns out it does. If we do aggressive partnerships with other organizations, including some that might be defined as interest organizations, but if we co-sponsor events or if we do distribution partnerships with them, does that help increase our potential audience? As it turns out, it does. That's a long-winded way, Tom, of saying that I think for organizations like yours, I would start asking questions like, who else is interested in issues of food and food safety and environmental husbandry of food? What partnerships might we craft with them? Might there be content distribution partnerships that we can craft with them purely to get our name out there? Might there be joint projects we can do with them? Might there be sharing of email lists that we can do with them to make sure that your fine work is getting exposed to other people who care about that topic? Another story by way of illustration. One of the case studies that I teach when I do versions of this for graduate students was a niche site set up in South Florida, a classical music review site set up by a guy by the name of Larry Johnson. He got bought out by the Miami Herald when they eliminated all their critics during the financial downturn. And Larry cut himself a deal with the Miami Herald to say, I'll continue to write reviews for you. You will pay me your standard freelance rate of only $50, but you can't post those reviews on your website. Instead, you're going to run a shirt tail at the bottom of every article in the print edition, and you're going to have reefers on your website directing them to my website. That one little trick turned out to give him entree to a very passionate community of classical music listeners in South Florida. Many of those people knew Larry because he was the guy. He was the best reviewer in town. They didn't know that Larry had set up his own site. There might be plenty of people out there who you could reach through a variety of partnerships or promotional deals with other people who play broadly in that space. That could be anything from lobbying organizations, that could be other food safety groups, that could be departments of agriculture and extension services in some states. The point being, there are lots of people who are interested in food safety. Some of them belong to other organizations that you might be able to use to your benefit by saying, here's some great content, put it out on your email list, put it out on your website, but link back to us. Make sure that you're using it in a way that it promotes your brand, your identity, your project, knowing that some of the people who find you through those other means will start entering and visiting your site more often and filling the top of that funnel. That's just one thought. As I make my long drive home through the snow today here in the DC area, I'll ponder some others and maybe ping you privately. Excellent question, though.
Thanks very much.
Other thoughts, other questions?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
A little bit faint, but go ahead.
Hey, this is Andrew Epstein from the Marshall Project.
How's my friend Joe Neff doing for you guys?
Oh, Joe is great. Joe is I mean, Joe is one of those people who, when we want to partner with almost any newspaper in the country on some of our stories, he'll know somebody there. He'll know the right person there.
Joe is one of the best. He and I did a fellowship together many years ago, and it took me about 15 seconds to realize he is a much more badass reporter than I could ever dream of being.
He really is. He really is. Well, I'll tell him you said hi.
Please do.
We've done a poor job, I think, of search engine optimization, of using those resources, figuring out how to increase our Google ranking. One of the things that we've discovered recently is that when we partner our stories with larger news organizations, and they're almost always larger news organizations, Google will sometimes prioritize their version of the story far more than ours, because if it's on the New York Times or it's on the Daily Beast, so we're trying to think through ways to deal with that. I'm just wondering if you have any general thoughts on how important that is. Once you've identified this larger community of interest or passion, how important focusing on Google rankings, SEO is to developing then that new layer of readership.
So that presupposes that you want your site to be a destination for people. In most cases, I think that's right. Although ProPublica has been very unabashed in saying, if the traffic goes to NBC, we don't care. If the traffic goes to this news network, we don't care. But if you want to be the destination site, I think you hit it. You have to make sure every partnership, every distribution deal you do has benefit for you, both in terms of the audience that it pours back directly to your site, as well as the Google ranking juice that comes with that. If I were doing that kind of a deal with the New York Times, I might say, you get this version of the story, but you have to say somewhere in that story, for the raw data or for more on this, go off to the Marshall site, and here's the URL. If you have, and the New York Times would probably go, nice try, no, because we're in the New York Times.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
But if you're doing it with perhaps with a local daily or a regional news organization or an NPR station or a statewide network, you might be able to say, we're going to divide up the content in ways that some of it lives on your side, but a lot of it, some of the high value stuff lives on our side, and we'll refer back and forth. You might be able to say, we demand X number of links in your metadata that come back to our website, because as much as Google changes their algorithms, it's very apparent that the one thing that is still very important is a link from a site that Google declares to be a high quality site, like most classic news and information sites, back to your site carries a great deal of weight to their algorithm. So looking for ways to increase the number of links from high quality sites. A very common technique, I'm no SEO expert, but I've worked with some great ones over the years. A very common technique when you've got a major project dropping is simply going out and doing outreach, getting Joe to call a bunch of his buddies at other papers and saying, we got something dropping next Monday. It may be the kind of thing that you're interested in and that you would want a link to from whatever aggregation you do of interesting headlines around the topic. That volume of multiple links pointing back to your story can be a very powerful tool for increasing Google rankings. I will say that in general, being thoughtful, having as part of your broader audience development strategy, having an SEO specific strategy it's important, it's worth doing. That doesn't mean you got to go out and hire a full-time SEO expert. It might mean having somebody on your team, possibly the same person who's helping you analyze your own metrics, your own analytics data. Might mean having that person be your in-house SEO expert part-time. Might be going out and hiring a freelance SEO expert to spend 5 or 10 hours a week, or maybe spend 50 hours over the course of one big project, making sure that you're harvesting as much of that SEO power as possible. I see a lot in public media, even with some of my commercial clients. I see the frequent mistake of, we've got audience coming in the top of the funnel, hit them up for money right now. Remember that the goal of SEO is not to get people to turn around and write you that check on the first visit to your site. The goal is really expose your brand to them, expose all of your other awesome work to them, so that some portion, maybe you bring in 100 people, but 20 of them become regular readers of your site. And out of that 20, maybe one writes you a check at the end of it all. There is a commercial client I work with, who I shall not name, that makes the mistake every time you hit one of their local news sites. The moment you go to scroll off the page, they hit you with a pop-up window. Do you want to subscribe? And from a Facebook link, and you're asking me for money? You know, do you go to a speed dating session at a bar and ask somebody to marry you at the end of it? No, it's crazy, it's spooky. Instead, know that out of those people who come in at the top, through your link building, through your SEO work, some of them are going to return. And those are the people you really want to start to build that relationship with, knowing that some of them will eventually write you a check. That's an excellent question about SEO. We'll touch on it some in the broader class. It is a vital part of every good audience development plan. Excellent question.
Great, thank you so much.
There's a question, Tom, and I think you just talked about it a little bit, but I'll go ahead and say it. Can you elaborate on the proportion of people along various levels of the audience funnel are likely, I think what proportion of the people along the various level of the audience funnel are likely to donate?
Yeah, excellent question. There is a ton of research still being done around that. I don't think anybody has hard and fast rules, but there are a couple data points that I do want to throw out. One of the things that drives me nuts about the In Denver Times folks is that 50,000 number that they hung their entire business plan on was based on this math. Well, the Rocky had 150,000 readers, and if we get 1/3 of them, we'll raise $3 million, and $3 million is enough for 30 of us. They went at it completely ass backwards. They could have made one phone call. They could have called Doug Price, the president and CEO of Rocky Mountain PBS. Doug's a really good guy, and he would have told them, guys, I've been at this, my organization's been at this for 40 years. We barely have 50,000 members. And you're trying to get 50,000 in a week? No, here's the rule of thumb in public media. 5% of your listeners or your viewers will become members and write you a check. If you're really, really good, like WAMU here in Washington, or Minnesota Public Radio in the Twin Cities, or WUNC, the statewide NPR network in North Carolina, if you're really good, you might get 8% of those listeners to give you money. So even in the newspaper subscription world, as more and more organizations like the Times and the Post are pivoting towards pushing subscriptions, they're finding that about 7 to 8% of their raw number of total readers will actually become subscribers at the end of a long process. On the one hand, that seems a little bit depressing. We're reaching all of these people and only a tiny portion of them will give us money. I compare that to fighting the ocean. That's just the reality. So the challenge then becomes understanding if 5% of the people I can expose my brand to will give me money. Number one, how do I scale my organization so that I can live off the money that I can raise from that 5%? And number two, how do I make sure more people are constantly being poured into the top of that funnel, knowing that if I get 100 new people coming in every week at the top, at the end of a long process, it might take a year, at the end, out of those 100, 5 of them will write me a check. So it's thinking in terms of that funnel not being a static thing, but this living thing where you're always pouring new people in at the top, you're always getting new people writing you a check at the bottom, knowing some of the people who wrote you a check last year aren't going to this year. It's an excellent question. I don't know of any great research showing every step along the way. There's a lot of experimenting going on. God, I saw a number just the other day that the Seattle Times is discovering. Something as basic as getting people to sign up for an email newsletter makes them 25 times more likely to subscribe to the Seattle Times than a random visitor coming in from Facebook. So there's a lot of interesting experimenting going on. When we send out a follow-up link that'll have a Clay Christensen reading for those of you who are interested in it, I'll also include links to a couple of those projects where there's some really interesting thinking and research going on about this membership and audience development process right now.
Are there any other questions about the class and or the presentation? This would be a good time. Tom's the deliverer of the information and the taskmaster who will get you to a development plan. This would be a good time to ask. We posted the link in chat to the class. You can see a more in-depth course description in the syllabus. You also have a link to sign up if you're ready to sign up. Honestly, the date will be dependent on the number of people we have sign up. I mean, we need to have a certain number of people committed to the class before we will start the class. So although we're shooting for a mid-April start, that is not cast in stone. We need to get the right number of people to be in the class. Could you, go ahead.
This is Diana Jean Shemo from 100 Reporters. And I have a question that I have been hesitating to ask because I think our organization is a little bit different from the others in that we are writing both internationally and domestically. And then we have the film festival that we do, which is sort of our big deal project each year in Symposium. And I guess my question is, you know, I feel like the challenge that we face is that on the news side, as opposed to say the festival side, which is you know, very healthy and growing, on the news side, it seems like we have you know, investigative projects that take a long time to drop, and that, you know, our audience is kind of global and it varies for each story. Like for one story, it may have to do with, you know, family courts in the US. Another story will have to do with you know, natural resources in Africa. How do we kind of go about building the audience for, you know, each story, which seems like, you know, I feel like we're sort of creating a new small business with every story that we write, and it's really hard.
It is, but I think that's exactly the approach that you have to think through, because each, you know, the overlap between the audience for an investigative piece about family courts may be 0 compared with the audience you're going to get for some of those international pieces. There literally maybe no or very, very tiny overlap. I think you need to think through each project on its own. What's the outreach that we do to bloggers, to influencers, to the interest groups in that space, so that when that project drops, it gets the attention among the right group of people? How do we harvest information about who some of those people are? You know, if you're doing ongoing work or follow-up work, how do you get some of them to give you an email address to sign up for updates on this important project, knowing that some portion of those people may be willing to support the cause and support that ongoing work by writing you a check? You almost, each of those is its own separate little audience development funnel. And let's not kid ourselves, that's hard work.
Well, that's, I'm almost at the point of wondering whether that's even sort of sustainable as a model, because it seems like, you know, we do a story on family courts, but we may not come back to it again for a year or maybe ever, depending on whether the freelance reporter who put in all that work is still available to do it, and you know, somebody else would pick it up. So I'm sort of at the point of wondering whether, you know, that kind of a model is even possible to do, because you're not, it doesn't feel like you're building a consistent audience that is going to be coming back to you for the same thing over and over. It seems like, you know, you're capturing this and then you're capturing that, and what do you do with that?
I think that's exactly right, Diana. I would say that my friend and former colleague, Robert Niles, who talks passionately about the best sustainable projects, they build communities of interest in many cases. And the challenge with the model you just described, you know, of funding very important and worthy, but largely one-off projects, is you're not really building a community over time. You're building a series of different communities that you're maybe then not engaging with and sustaining over time. Now, there are lots of ways that you could address that. Maybe you could say, we're going to focus our work on, making this up, 3 or 4 areas. Or we're going to make sure that every project that we provide seed funding for has a long-term sustainability plan, probably by attaching it to some other organization that is going to engage that community of interest over a longer period of time. If you're doing something, I'm making this up again, crime or the criminal justice system, you know what, we're gonna make sure that we're connected and closely with the Marshall Project, because that's what they do, and they can make sure that this community of interest that we build can be sustained over time.
How does that?
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask that. How does that help us grow? If we are building a community and handing it off to another organization, how does that help us grow?
Conceivably, a couple ways. Number one, it may be that you can do some joint fundraising with some of these other partner organizations. It may be that some of the foundations and philanthropies that you work with, that you position yourself to them as, we do seed funding for what become these long-term efforts that other people carry out. And that seed funding serves to help attack the problem that you, Ms. Foundation Program Officer, or you, Ms. Philanthropist, we're helping to fix the problems that you want to fix. So there are a couple ways that you can approach and attack it, but I would agree, being an organization that provides that kind of seed funding on a non-continuous basis in any given area, that's a tricky set of challenges.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Tom, do you have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, let me just speak. I mean, the advantage of being caught in a snowstorm here in DC is nothing's happening today, so I am happy to hang out.
We still have quite a few people on, so please either put your question in chat or just unmute yourself and get on. I'm not hearing from anyone. So with that, I want to thank you, Tom, for a wonderful webinar, and I hope that folks found it valuable. I also hope that people got a taste of what they're in for if they sign up for this class. Again, the goal of the class is that you will create an audience development plan, which may mean shifting audiences. It may mean focusing on a particular audience instead of being, everything to everybody, but that means usually nothing to anyone. So one of the key tenets of marketing and audience development is focus, right? So I'm, again, delighted, Tom, that you took time to do this webinar for us. And as I promised, he is quite sarcastic and full of energy, which I certainly appreciate. And with that, I think we will sign off. Please take a minute to complete the evaluation. As you know, that is an important part of INN's reporting back our impact to our funders. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you.